Hey, history fans, pull up a chair, because the story you're about to hear sounds like fiction, but every word of it comes from trial transcripts, captured diaries, and dusty files that the victors locked away for almost 80 years. There is a castle in the German countryside. Locals called it a neighborhood joke for centuries, a crooked medieval thing perched on a cliff above a sleepy village. Then, in the spring of 1934, a black Mercedes pulled up the winding road, and a thin man with wire glasses stepped out to inspect the stonework. He bought the ruin for almost no money, told the architect to draw up plans for a cathedral, and within 4 years his workers were carving runes into the beams. The castle was called Wewelsburg. The man was Heinrich Himmler, and the cathedral he wanted to build had no cross, no altar, and no Christian god. Inside the Third Reich, people would later whisper that the place was a temple. The SS officers who served there liked to call it the center of the world. To the rest of the world, it would become a footnote, a strange little curiosity in a war of panzer tanks and gas chambers. But the truth is the opposite. The temple at Wewelsburg was not a footnote at all. It was the headquarters of the strangest, most expensive, and most carefully hidden ideological project ever launched by a modern state. And the man who built it was not just a police chief. He was, in his own mind, the high priest of a brand new religion. So how do you replace a god? How do you convince millions of people that the Bible is a lie, that Jesus was a Germanic rebel, that the only true ancestors came out of the polar ice, and that the chalice from the Last Supper is actually a stone that was hidden by heretics in a French mountain? And how much money, how many professors, how many expeditions, how many skulls measured, how many libraries looted, how many ruined castles bought does it take to make that lie feel like the truth? The answer, as you are about to find out, is frighteningly specific. The SS spent more on prehistoric research than any government in human history. They ran a think tank with a budget bigger than several small countries put together. They shipped wooden crates of skulls back to Berlin. They sent scientists to Tibet, to Iceland, to the mountains of southern France, to the deserts of North Africa. They measured the heads of living aristocrats and the bones of their enslaved ancestors, and at the center of it all, sitting in a stone chamber at the top of a tower that pointed straight at the North Star, a man with spectacles and a notebook believed he was holding the thread of world history in his hands. This is the first part of a 4-part series on the Occult Reich. No tarot cards, no crystal balls, no movie villains in capes, just paperwork, professors, blueprints, and the slow, meticulous conversion of a police force into a pagan church. The story does not start with witches or seances. It starts, of all places, with a runestone. In 1933, a new boss took over the most feared uniformed organization in Germany. His name was Heinrich Himmler, and he had been a chicken farmer, a fertilizer salesman, and a failed naval officer before he found his true calling in the back rooms of a nationalist secret society in Munich. The society was called the Thule Group, and it met in a hotel near the train station. Its members drank beer, argued about the origins of the Aryan race, and traded pamphlets that claimed the world had once been ruled by a civilization of supermen from a lost continent in the north. When the Thule Society splintered into political parties, Himmler attached himself to the most violent splinter, the one that would later call itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He climbed the ranks by being useful, being organized, and by absolutely refusing to share credit with anyone. By the time he became Reichsfuhrer of the SS, the man had a single, obsessive idea. He believed that the Germanic people were the heirs of a hidden, ancient, almost sacred civilization that had been destroyed by Rome, then smothered by the Church, then poisoned by the Jews. He believed the only way to save the German people was to peel back 2,000 years of what he called race betrayal, and to expose the original, pure, pagan faith that had existed underneath it. Christianity, in his view, was a foreign skin stretched over a Germanic body. His job, as he understood it, was to peel that skin off. To do that, he needed more than a political party. He needed a church, He needed its priests, its temples, its calendar, its holy books, its rituals, its saints, its founding myths. And so he set about building exactly that, with the kind of calm, bureaucratic patience that honest people reserve for things like tax reform and cathedral construction. The first institution he built was the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, which the Germans called the Ruscha. This was the marriage bureau of the new religion. It screened every SS applicant for what the officers called racial purity. It issued permits to marry. It kept a giant card file of approved bloodlines. It also organized an elaborate wedding ritual that replaced the Christian one. Brides and grooms stood in front of a black swastika banner instead of an altar. They held burning candles. They swore oaths to Hitler, to the SS, and to their unborn children. The candles were not Christian. The oaths were not Christian. The brides were inspected beforehand by a doctor and a racial examiner, just to make sure their teeth were the right shape and their skull had the right dimensions. This was how Germany's new religion performed a wedding. The second institution was the Ahnenerbe, which is a German word that roughly translates to something like inherited from the ancestors. It was officially founded in 1935 as a scholarly think tank, and Himmler put a man named Hermann Wirth in charge of it. Wirth was a folklorist who believed, sincerely and in print, that all human culture had started in a northern paradise that he called the original homeland. He was a dreamer, and Himmler soon judged him to be too soft. By 1937, Wirth was out. Himmler took direct control of the organization, and he gave the operational job to a quiet, efficient accountant named Wolfram Sievers. Under Sievers, the Ahnenerbe became something much more dangerous than a club of romantics. It became a fully funded research factory with a separate budget, its own expeditions, its own staff, and almost no outside oversight. By 1939, the Ahnenerbe was spending more than 1 million Reichsmarks a year on what it called inherited knowledge. That money bought radiocarbon dating equipment. It bought anthropologist calipers. It bought ocean liner tickets to Iceland. It bought crates of plaster for casting the heads of living Tibetans. It bought typewriters and filing cabinets and pretty decent salaries for university professors who were willing to look the other way on the question of what they were really working for. The institute was not a museum. It was a proof factory. Its job was not to admire the past. Its job was to prove, with the trappings of science, that the glorious past had really happened. The third institution was Wewelsburg itself. The castle stands in a triangle of Westphalian farmland near the town of Paderborn. Himmler chose it because its shape, when seen from above, reminded him of a spearhead. He bought the property for a song, then quietly evicted the local museum and the youth hostel that had been using it. He brought in architects, builders, and a small army of craftsmen. He told the local brick company that the work was for a school. He told the workers that the strange symbols they were carving into the oak beams were decorative. The plan was jaw-dropping. The architect drew a grand design that would have transformed the mountain into a kind of cathedral complex. A central tower pointed north. Underneath the tower, deep in the rock, a vault was carved out for the ashes of dead SS officers. On the top floor, a circular room called the Green Room was designed to hold meetings of 12 elite initiates, called the Thule Knights. Around the long dining hall, a table was built to seat the same 12. Underneath the table, a carved ring held the names of fallen comrades, dead forever in the stone. The whole thing was a reverse-engineered imitation of a medieval royal court, except the king was Himmler, the knights were murderers, and the cathedral was a confession booth for a faith that nobody had ever heard of before. None of this appeared in a budget line that anyone could read. The money moved through shell foundations, through charities, through the personal bank accounts of SS officers. The blueprints were classified. The workers were given vague job descriptions. And the purpose of the work was hidden behind language so pompous that even the people doing it sometimes lost track of what they were building. The mythology that justified all this paperwork was a stew of very old lies. Back in the 1800s, a writer named Guido von List claimed that the old runic alphabet was a sacred code left behind by the ancient Germanic gods. A defrocked monk named Georg Lanz von Liebenfels wrote pamphlets describing a prehistoric race war between pure Aryans and ape-like inferior peoples. A forged manuscript called the Ura-Linda Chronicle pretended to prove that an ancient Frisian civilization had invented writing, astronomy, and democracy before the Greeks even existed. All of these fakes were treated, inside the SS, as sacred texts. Himmler himself took notes in the margins of his own copies, and he wrote little corrections to make the myths line up with his own private theology. On the ground, the practical results were almost comically ordinary. SS families were encouraged to name their children after pagan gods. Newborns were registered as Thor, as Sigrun, as Hilmar. The SS published its own calendar, replacing the names of Christian saints with the names of dead Germanic heroes. There were summer solstice celebrations and winter solstice ceremonies. Couples exchanged rings engraved with runes. Officers wore silver rings with a death's head and a tiny sigil that Himmler had personally designed. None of this was secret. It was just presented, year after year, as the normal way of being a faithful German. And here is the part that most people misunderstand. The point was not to make every German a believer. The point was to make every German a participant. You did not have to read the pamphlets. You did not have to know the names of the imaginary gods. You just had to show up at the wedding, bow at the right moment, send your kids to the right school, and let the file clerk at the Russia decide who was allowed to marry whom. The new religion was a system, not a sermon. It ran on paperwork, not on prayer. By the end of the 1930s, Himmler had built himself something that no dictator in history had ever quite managed. He had built a fully functioning ideological empire inside the larger state. It had its own priests, who happened to be SS officers. It had its own temples, which happened to be castles and conference halls. It had its own calendar, its own marriage rites, its own ethnography, its own archaeology, and its own private army of professors. The war that began in 1939 was, in Himmler's mind, simply the moment when this cathedral finally opened its doors to the world. That is where the next chapter begins. The cathedral needed relics. Every church needs a holy object, and Himmler had decided that his holy object would be the most famous one of all. So he sent his men to find the Grail. Every church in history has needed a relic, a physical object so charged with meaning that touching it feels like touching the holy itself. By 1938, the cathedral Himmler had built inside the SS was finished, on paper at least, and it was hungry for exactly that kind of treasure. He had his priests, his temples, his rituals, his wedding ceremonies, his runic rings. What he did not have, and what every serious religion demands, was a sacred object around which the whole story could be organized. The obvious candidate, the one every European already knew about, was the Holy Grail. But here is the trick, and it is the heart of this chapter. The Grail that Himmler wanted was not the Grail of Christian legend. It was something stranger, older, and far more useful to his purposes. He wanted the version of the Grail that had been invented, centuries earlier, by a German poet who had quietly rejected the entire Christian version of the story and replaced it with something much more dangerous. And the men he sent to look for that version, scholars with permits and code names, ended up traveling through burning monasteries, occupied libraries, and the bombed-out castles of southern France, looking for a chalice that, according to the poem they revered, had never actually been a chalice at all. The famous Grail story most people know, the one with the round table and the bleeding lance and the quest for a cup, came from France in the Middle Ages. A writer named Chrétien de Troyes put the first complete version on paper around the year 1200. In his telling, the Grail is a vessel, the cup from the Last Supper, carried to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea, guarded by a fisher king whose lands are wasting because of an ancient wound. This is the version that fed straight into the Christian imagination. It says, "Look here, the cup that caught the blood of Christ has been preserved, and a pure knight can find it if he is worthy." But almost a century later, a German poet named Wolfram von Eschenbach rewrote the entire story in his massive poem Parzival. Wolfram had spent time in the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he had opinions. In his version, the Grail is not a cup, it is a stone. It fell from the sky, it gives food to the worthy, it heals the wounded, and it is guarded by a community of initiates who are explicitly pagan in their customs, who worship pagan gods under Christian cover, and whose whole kingdom exists outside the reach of Rome. Wolfram even named a pagan religion made of very old Germanic pieces as the true faith of the Grail Temple. This was heresy in plain verse, smuggled into the most famous story of the age. The poem was so beautiful and so popular that nobody in authority managed to suppress it. Wagner later used the same material for his operas. The young Adolf Hitler read it in his Vienna years, and he later told Speer that he had been obsessed with the Grail story as a teenager. But it was Himmler, with his manic attention to the details of medieval manuscripts, who really understood what Wolfram had done. Wolfram had given the Germanic people a sacred object that was not Christian. He had described a holy thing that belonged to a pagan faith and had been hidden, violently, by the Catholic Church. For Himmler, this was not literature. It was a roadmap. The first man Himmler hired to actually walk that roadmap was a strange, unhappy scholar named Otto Rahn. Rahn was born in 1904 in a small town in the Odenwald, in central Germany. He was a romantic, a loner, a lover of ruined castles, and a deeply unhappy man who drank too much and wrote in a feverish style that made his books feel more like confessions than like academic studies. In 1933, while still a graduate student, he published a book called Crusade Against the Grail, and the book made him instantly famous in the small, strange world of Germanic mysticism. In Crusade Against the Grail, Rahn argued that the story of the Grail was actually a coded memory of a real war. The noble pagans of Wolfram's poem were the Cathars, a medieval Christian group in southern France whom the Catholic Church had slaughtered in a series of brutal crusades that lasted almost a century. According to Rahn, the Cathars had preserved something precious, a pagan relic, a symbol of pure Aryan spirituality, and they had hidden it in the mountain fortress of Montségur before the besieging army finally broke them in 1244. Rahn never identified what the relic actually was, in physical terms, and he never claimed to have found it. He did not need to. He had done something more valuable. He had given Himmler a place to send an expedition. Himmler bought the book, read it in one sitting, and ordered Rahn brought to Berlin. By 1935, Rahn had a position inside the Ahnenerbe, a research budget, and a portfolio of countries he was allowed to visit on the Reich's dime. He traveled to France, to Spain, to Italy, to the Vatican Library, to the monastery of Montserrat outside Barcelona, to the ruined Cathar castles of the Languedoc, and to libraries in Montpellier, Carcassonne, and Toulouse. He photographed manuscripts, took notes, and produced a second book, this one called Lucifer's Court, which Himmler also devoured. Lucifer's Court was not really a scholarly work. It was a personal diary of despair. Rahn was beginning to feel that he had been hired not to study Cathars, but to confirm a story Himmler already believed. He was right about that. By the late 1930s, Rahn had become a serious problem for his own employer. He had spent years inside the Himmler machine, and he had begun to suspect that the machine was not really interested in the truth. He drank heavily, he quarreled with his handlers, and he spoke openly about defecting. On the 13th of March 1939, he was found dead on the ground near the inn at Kufstein, in the Austrian Tyrol. The official report said suicide. The persistent rumor said murder. The truth has never been established. What is certain is that Himmler lost his favorite Grail scholar that spring, and he replaced him with a much more disciplined team. The expeditions that followed Ron's death were not the wild treasure hunts of pulp fiction. They were mid-century research operations, run by men in SS uniform with proper paperwork, real budgets, and the cooperation of German occupation authorities whenever they walked into a foreign library or a monastery. The goal was never stated openly. No official document ever said, "Go find the Grail." The order was always phrased in colder language. The team was sent to gather, study, and if necessary, secure certain materials of religious and cultural significance to the Germanic peoples. What those materials were depended entirely on who was reading the order. One of the most ambitious of these missions took place at the monastery of Montserrat, in Catalonia, the jagged mountain that looms over the flat farmland north of Barcelona. The monastery had been one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Spain, and it had a library famous for its medieval manuscripts, including Catalan and Latin copies of Grail stories. A research team sent by the Ahnenerbe spent the years from 1937 to 1939 working through the collection, photographing pages, and copying out references to rituals and symbols that interested them. In October of 1940, after the German occupation of France and the diplomatic maneuvering that gave German agents access to neutral Spain, Himmler himself made a rare on-site visit. He toured the monastery with a small entourage, asked questions about the history of the library, and was photographed standing on the steps of the basilica with a faint, satisfied smile. The visit was reported in the German press. The library is still there. The research files are in the Bundesarchiv. A second, even more theatrical mission unfolded in the north of France, in 1941. Himmler, who was now one of the most powerful officials in the occupied continent, arranged a personal tour of Brittany. The official purpose was to inspect SS recruitment in the West. The hidden purpose was a pilgrimage to Mont Saint-Michel, the famous island abbey that had become, in Germanic Romantic writing, the western twin of Wewelsburg, the temple of a vanished pre-Christian sea faith. Photographs from that tour, taken in July of 1941, show Himmler on the beach at Mont Saint-Michel, dressed in his long SS overcoat, his face tilted upward toward the abbey, his lips pressed together in the satisfied expression of a man who believes he is reclaiming something the church stole from him. The trip was arranged with the help of Karl Maria Villegut, who had been quietly slipped into Himmler's entourage in 1933 and who had become, over time, a kind of personal occult advisor. Meanwhile, deep inside Wewelsburg, the Grail had been brought back in a different form, as architecture. According to post-war testimony from Karl Heuser, who had served as the castle's architect, the long table in the North Tower dining hall was modeled, in its proportions and its symbolism, on the Round Table tradition, on the Arthurian ideal of a chosen brotherhood around a single center. The design of the room was not an accident. It was an attempt to create inside the SS a permanent ritual space where a select few could reenact the world of Parzival in the uniforms of the 20th century. Beneath the long table, as already mentioned in the previous hour, a circular recess had been carved into the floor to receive an ever-growing list of names, the Death Ring, a pagan book of the dead written in soldier ranks and surnames. The wider obsession with the Cathar country, the old Languedoc region south of the Massif Central, continued for years. From 1942 to 1944, as German forces occupied the southern zone of France in response to the Allied landings in North Africa, small SS units were detached from their military duties to investigate specific sites. They were sent to Montségur. They were sent to the so-called treasure house at Rennes-le-Château, a village that had been rediscovered in the 19th century by a local priest who claimed to have found ancient parchments under his altar. They were sent to the Cathar castles of Carabas, Peyrepertuis, and Aguilar. In every case, the orders emphasized the recovery of documents and objects of cultural value to the Germanic Reich. What those words meant, in practice, was left to the judgment of the men on the ground. Most of the units returned with nothing more than photographs and handwritten notes. The treasure, if there was ever a treasure in the way the poets imagined one, was not found. It would be easy, and very common, to treat these expeditions as crackpot theater. The standard telling, both in the post-war esoteric press and in many cheap documentaries, is that Himmler was chasing a literal cup, that he believed in magic, that he sent Otto Rahn to find a golden chalice and was furious when the young man came back empty-handed. None of that is true. Himmler was chasing something much more important than a cup. He was chasing a story. He wanted the world to believe that the great sacred objects of European religion were really Germanic objects, hidden by the church, misnamed by the priests, and waiting for an Aryan priest-king to come and reclaim them. The Grail was useful because it was already famous. The Grail was useful because every European already had an opinion about it. The Grail was useful because Wolfram von Eschenbach, that brilliant medieval heretic, had already done the most important piece of propaganda work, 3 centuries before Himmler was born, by quietly turning the chalice of the Last Supper into a stone from the sky. What Himmler added was bureaucracy. What he added was the Ahnenerbe. What he added was the conviction that the story should be investigated with calipers and cameras and file folders, until it became, in the minds of the German public, a kind of historical fact rather than a medieval poem. And yet for all the expeditions, the photographs, the man-hours, the millions of marks, the Grail was never found, because the Grail, in the form Himmler wanted it, had never existed. There was no Aryan cup hidden in a French mountain. There was no pagan inheritance waiting to be unsealed by a chosen SS officer. The expeditions proved the negative 1,000 times over, and the men who ran them knew, in their more honest moments, that they had been sent out to confirm something their master already believed. That is the dark joke at the heart of the Grail hunt. The treasure was never the chalice. The treasure was the journey itself, and the apparatus that made the journey possible. Every report that came back from Catalonia or Languedoc was, in its own small way, another brick in the cathedral Himmler was already building. And that brings us, naturally, to the third object that obsessed the SS leadership, an object that, unlike the Grail, was very real, very physical, and very much in the news of 1938. It was not a chalice, it was a spear. And the strange thing about the spear is that the Allies ended up fighting over it, in 1945, just as hard as the SS had. The story now turns from cups that were never cups to a weapon that was always a weapon. And this one, unlike the Grail, was real. You could hold it, you could photograph it, you could measure the iron in its blade. And in 1938, after the Anschluss, a young Austrian clerk at the Imperial Treasury in Vienna walked into the back room of the Schatzkammer and found the entire mythology of the Third Reich waiting on a velvet cushion. The object in question is called the Holy Lance of Vienna, and it is one of the most famous medieval relics in the world. At first glance, it looks like a long iron spear, slightly bent with age, with a rusty nail driven through its socket, and a strip of silver and gold wound around the base of the blade. According to the legend written on the display case, this is the spear that the Roman soldier Longinus used to pierce the side of Christ on the cross. According to the inventory of the Schatzkammer, which is a much more cautious document, it is an early medieval weapon of undetermined date, possibly brought to the West by the Byzantine court in the 7th or 8th century, and modified in the 9th century by a goldsmith who added the nail and the silver binding. Both statements are true, in their way. The forgery is medieval. The forgery is also what made the object sacred. The chain of custody is its own kind of magic. The spear passed, by gift and by theft, through the hands of Constantine, of Theodosius, of Charlemagne, of Frederick Barbarossa, of Charles IV, and then into the Habsburg collection, where it sat for almost 400 years, watched over by court librarians and adored by pilgrims. After the fall of the monarchy in 1918, the new Austrian Republic inherited the lance along with the rest of the imperial regalia. By 1938, the object had been on public display for less than 20 years, and very few Austrians had bothered to look at it closely. That was about to change. On the night of March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. Hitler himself followed the next morning, riding through the villages of his childhood in an open car, waving at crowds he had spent the last decade describing as traitors. Within 72 hours, the Anschluss was complete. The Austrian government had been absorbed, and the imperial regalia of the Habsburgs had become, in effect, the property of the German state. This was a political earthquake. For a generation of pan-German romantics, including Hitler himself, it was also a religious one. The spear was now in German hands. Hitler's first documented visit to the Schatzkammer took place on October 9, 1938, 7 months after the Anschluss. The visit is recorded in the museum's guest book. It is also recorded in a photograph that has since become one of the most reproduced images in 20th century history. A quiet, almost tender shot of the Führer leaning slightly forward, eyes on the lance, hands clasped behind his back, his mouth set in a thin, focused line. The photograph looks like a pilgrim at a shrine. The museum staff remembered it as something stranger, the look of a man taking inventory of a captured weapon. For Hitler, the lance was not just a relic, it was a precedent. Generals had carried it into battle for 1,000 years. Emperors had touched it before they signed treaties. Possession of the spear, in the medieval imagination, conferred a kind of cosmic legitimacy on whoever held it. Whoever owned the lance owned the right to rule. This was exactly the kind of idea that a corporal from Linz, who had spent his youth haunting the corridors of the Hofburg, could not help but find intoxicating. The SS moved quickly. Within weeks of the Anschluss, a small detachment known as the Schatzkammer Schutz was assigned to guard the relic. Its orders came directly from Himmler's office. Its job was to make sure that the lance and the other regalia of the old empire stayed under German eyes, in a German vault, and were never lent out again to any foreign power. By the autumn of 1938, the relic had its own private guard, its own paperwork, and its own small place in the vast bureaucratic machinery that the SS was building around every object it considered sacred. And this is where the question that serious historians keep asking becomes unavoidable. Was Hitler really a believer, or was he just a man who understood the power of a good photograph? The honest answer, after 80 years of scholarship, is that the distinction does not matter very much. Hitler spoke often about the lance in his private circle. Henry Picker, the notary who recorded Hitler's table talk during the war, noted at least half a dozen occasions when the Führer returned to the subject, almost always in the same tone, half joking, half serious, the tone of a man who wanted his audience to know that he took the object seriously without quite admitting that he took it literally. The references in the Bormann transcripts, taken from the same period, use the word talisman in a slightly mocking way, but they use it. The pattern was the same one Himmler had used for the Grail. The spear was assigned meaning. The meaning was circulated through lectures, through pamphlets, through the SS newspaper Das Schwarze Korps, and through carefully staged visits by mid-level party officials to the Schatzkammer. By the late 1930s, any reasonably educated German knew two things about the lance. First, that it was the weapon of Longinus. Second, that it had been carried by every great emperor since Charlemagne, and that its possession by a new German ruler was a sign, if not of divine election, then at least of historical continuity. This was propaganda of the cheapest and most effective kind, because it did not require the audience to believe anything supernatural. It only required them to feel something patriotic. The wider strategic uses of the lance are harder to measure, but the paperwork is suggestive. In 1940 and 1941, SS Kunstschutz units attached to the German army in Italy were given unusually detailed orders to protect church property in and around Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine abbey south of Rome. Monte Cassino was not on any list of Jewish art. Monte Cassino did not contain imperial regalia. It did, however, contain a famous relic of its own, the remains of Saint Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, and the German orders, as captured by Allied intelligence officers after the war, repeatedly refer to the abbey as a site of imperial significance. The orders do not mention the lance by name. The orders do not need to. The pattern is the same pattern, applied with the same bureaucratic patience. What makes the lance different from the Grail is that the war over the lance did not end in 1945. It began there. When Allied forces closed in on Bavaria in the spring of 1945, the SS leadership, now operating in fragments and panicking for the first time in the war, gave the order to evacuate the imperial regalia from the Schatzkammer. The lance, along with the imperial crown, the orb, the scepter, and several smaller objects, was packed into wooden crates and loaded onto a convoy that crawled east through the bombed-out Autobahn toward the supposed safety of a salt mine near Berchtesgaden. It never made it. The convoy was intercepted by American troops. The crates were opened by a monuments officer named Colonel Walter Horn, a German-speaking Czech who had spent his career studying medieval art. Horn photographed the contents, sealed the crates, and arranged for them to be stored in a converted bank vault in the city of Nuremberg, in the same district where, a few months later, the trials of the surviving Nazi leadership would open. The story now moves to Patton. George S. Patton, the Third Army commander, had a reputation for eccentric reading. He had brought a small library of medieval history with him across France, and he had a soft spot for chivalric romance. When he learned that the imperial regalia were under his jurisdiction, he made a personal inspection, and he is reported to have treated the lance with a kind of rough respect. The post-war esoteric press, which is not to be confused with serious historiography, latched onto this visit and turned Patton into a kind of American Himmler, a soldier who secretly believed in the magic of relics. The claim has been repeated so often that it has become folklore. The fact is more mundane and a little more interesting. Patton did not believe in the magic. Patton believed, like every educated officer of his generation, that relics were historically important, that the German army had gone out of its way to protect them, and that the right thing to do was to put them in a museum. His superiors in Washington disagreed. General Eisenhower, who understood the diplomatic value of the gesture, ordered the lance returned to Austria in January of 1946, in a quiet ceremony at the Austrian border, without press coverage and without photographs. The Austrians put it back in the Schatzkammer. It is still there, behind glass, visited by tourists who rarely know the story. The interesting question is not whether the lance was magic. It obviously was not. The interesting question is why both the Nazis and the Allies were willing to spend so much time, so much gasoline, and so many soldiers on the question of who held it. The answer, as so often in this story, has less to do with the supernatural than with the bureaucratic. A relic is a piece of paperwork in physical form. It confers legitimacy on the institution that holds it. Whoever holds the lance can claim, in language that even the most cynical politician cannot quite dismiss, that history has chosen them. Himmler understood that. Hitler understood that. Eisenhower, in his more cautious moments, understood that too. The SS obsession with the lance was, in this sense, the most successful piece of occult propaganda the Third Reich ever produced. It was successful not because anyone believed in the magic, but because everyone believed in the politics. The lance was real. The empire it legitimized was real. The chain of custody was real. The only part that was not real was the idea that the chain of custody had any supernatural power. And that idea, stripped of its medieval costume, was simply the idea that power flows through objects, that offices acquire dignity through their furniture, that a new state can borrow the prestige of an old one by borrowing its relics. Every modern state has done this. Every modern state still does. The SS just did it more loudly and with more paperwork. There is also a comparative case that makes the German story look slightly less bizarre. Stalin, in the same decade, was busy reattaching the Russian Orthodox Church to the state, restoring the Patriarchate in 1943, returning church property, opening seminaries, and letting the Patriarch bless the troops in public ceremonies. The gesture was cynical. The gesture also worked. The bones of St. Sergius, in the Trinity Lavra, served exactly the same legitimizing function as the lance in the Schatzkammer, and they were managed with exactly the same combination of bureaucratic seriousness and ideological opportunism. Relic questing, in the middle of the 20th century, was not a German specialty. It was an authoritarian reflex, and it infected every dictatorship on the continent. What remains, 80 years later, is the lance itself, still in Vienna, still in the same glass case, still drawing a small crowd of tourists every afternoon. The SS Guard detachment has long been disbanded. The photograph of Hitler looking at the relic has been printed so many times that it has lost the power to shock. The wartime paperwork about its evacuation is archived in the Bundesarchiv. The Monuments Men files are at Yale. The Nuremberg transcripts are online, and somewhere, in a salt mine in Berchtesgaden, there is still a shelf that was meant to hold the relic and never did. The real relic, in the end, was not the spear, it was the file folder. The SS did not find magic. It found paperwork, and the paperwork turned out to be more durable than the stonework at Wewelsburg, more portable than the Grail legends, and more politically useful than anything Himmler's professors ever wrote in their expedition reports. That is the lesson of the lance, and it is the lesson the Allies absorbed in 1946, when they quietly sent the object home and never quite explained to the public why they had bothered to chase it in the first place. And the story is not over. There is one more chapter, and it is the strangest of all, because it is about a place that did exist and a past that never did, about archaeologists who measured skulls and found nothing, about a castle that was meant to be the cathedral of a faith that only 12 men in the world ever joined, and about the post-war silence that keeps the whole thing alive. The fourth chapter of this strange history begins not with a relic and not with a chest of golden cups, but with a much older question, the kind that grown-ups ask each other in the back of a long car ride when the radio has gone fuzzy and the children are asleep. Where do we come from? And what were the people like who came before us? It is a question that every culture on Earth has tried to answer. By the time the 1930s arrived, a generation of European scholars had decided that the answer could be found by digging in the ground, by measuring bones, by tracing the shapes of pots and the patterns of words across old maps. Archaeology had become, in the space of a single human lifetime, the most romantic of the sciences. It also became, in the wrong hands, the most dangerous. Heinrich Himmler had decided, sometime in the middle of the 1930s, that the official German past was a lie. The teachers, the museum curators, the dusty professors with their felt hats and their Latin quotations had all been telling the German people that their ancestors came out of a dark forest somewhere north of the Danube and spent 1,000 years slowly learning how to be civilized by their more polished neighbors to the south. Himmler believed the opposite. He believed that the Germanic peoples had once been the teachers, not the students. He believed that there had been a civilization, long ago, before Greece and before Rome and before Babylon, a civilization of blonde, blue-eyed, technically gifted people who had built great cities, sailed across the oceans, and left behind, in the myths and the folk tales and the rune stones of Northern Europe, a coded memory of their lost greatness. The question was where that civilization had gone. A generation before Himmler was born, 2 writers had already supplied the answer. One was a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky, who lived in New York and Paris and wrote a huge, dreamy book called The Secret Doctrine in the year 1888. Blavatsky had never been to Tibet, had never read a Sanskrit manuscript in the original, and had invented most of the details of her own past, but she had a genius for catching the mood of the late 19th century, and she told her readers that there had once been a great continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a place she called Atlantis, whose survivors had drifted north and seeded the civilizations of Egypt, of Mexico, of Peru, and of Scandinavia. The other writer was an American congressman named Ignatius Donnelly, who in 1882 had published a thick, earnest volume called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in which he argued, with the confident sincerity of a small-town lawyer, that every important cultural achievement in human history was really a faded memory of the drowned continent. Neither book had any scientific value. Both books sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Both books were translated into German, and both books sat on the shelves of the young Heinrich Himmler when he was still a student in Munich. Around the same time, an Italian aristocrat named Julius Evola was writing books that took the Blavatsky tradition and gave it a sharper political edge. Evola did not believe in lost continents. He believed in lost spiritual orders, in ancient priest-kings who had once ruled the world through ritual purity, and in the modern degeneracy of parliamentary democracy. His books were translated into German in the early 1930s, and they were read carefully by the more thoughtful young men around Himmler, especially those who already suspected that the official Nazi movement, with its beer hall speeches and its jackboots and its middle-aged slogans, was not quite spiritual enough for the new Germany they wanted to build. The man who gave all of this its German address, the man who turned the lost continent into a lost homeland somewhere north of Norway, was a Dutch-born folklorist named Herman Wirth. Wirth was the original head of the Ahnenerbe, the scholarly think tank that Himmler had created to prove his theories about the ancient Germanic past. Wirth believed that an original, peaceful, matriarchal civilization had once stretched from Iceland across the North Atlantic and into the heart of what is now Germany, and he believed that this civilization had been destroyed by the violent, patriarchal Indo-European invaders who later became the classical Greeks, Romans, and Persians. The peaceful, wise, blonde, original people were, of course, the ancestors of the modern Germans. The violent destroyers were a mixture of Jews, Slavs, and Southern Europeans. This was not a thesis that Wirth had managed to publish in any serious peer-reviewed journal. It was, however, exactly the kind of story that Himmler wanted told, and so Wirth was given a desk, a salary, and a small staff of young researchers, and he was told to go and find the evidence. Within a few years, Wirth had been pushed aside as too soft, and the Ahnenerbe had been taken over by the more practical Wolfram Sievers, the quiet accountant who knew how to write a budget and how to lie to a university dean. Under Sievers, the Ahnenerbe launched the largest prehistoric research program ever attempted by a single state. Between 1936 and 1944, the Institute sent more than 30 separate expeditions into the field, from Iceland to the Caucasus, from Brittany to the Libyan desert, and it spent more money on archaeological and anthropological fieldwork than any government in Europe had spent on such work before or has spent since. The first major expedition went north in the summer of 1936 to Iceland. A team led by the young archaeologist Herbert Yankun and the Ahnenerbe administrator Wolfram Sievers himself spent several weeks on the island, photographing old rune stones, visiting the site of the ancient Althing at Thingvellir, and trying, with limited success, to find traces of an even older civilization beneath the Norse settlements. The expedition produced a thick report, a large collection of photographs, and a great many enthusiastic letters back to Berlin about how the Icelandic farmers had preserved the pure Germanic type in a way that the mixed-up Germans of the modern cities had not. None of this was scientifically interesting. All of it was politically useful. A second expedition, more famous and considerably more troubling, went east in the spring of 1938, to Tibet. The man chosen to lead it was a zoologist and big-game hunter named Ernst Schaefer, who had already made 2 earlier trips to the Tibetan plateau and who spoke passable Tibetan. Schaefer was a competent naturalist and a serious photographer. He was also a convinced National Socialist. His team included an anthropologist named Bruno Beger, whose job was to measure the heads, the noses, the earlobes, and the blood types of as many Tibetan aristocrats as could be persuaded to sit still long enough, and a geographer named Karl Wienert, whose job was to make sure that the expedition's maps were accurate enough to be useful to a future German army in Central Asia. The Schaefer expedition brought back several hundred plaster casts of Tibetan faces, thousands of photographs, and a small but well-documented collection of skulls and skeletons. Most of this material ended up, after the war, in the Bundesarchiv and in a few university basements, where it has since embarrassed the institutions that inherited it. Bager was eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to a short prison term for his role in the collection of human remains. Schaefer, the leader, was never tried at all. A third wave of expeditions went west, into the lands that the SS believed were the westernmost outposts of the lost northern homeland. In 1941, after the German occupation of France, a small team was sent to Brittany to measure the heads of the local population and to photograph the great prehistoric standing stones that the Breton farmers called menhirs. The team, led by a young researcher named Karl Ernst Adolfsson, produced a fat report arguing that the Breton peasants were the purest surviving descendants of the original Atlantic Germanic people, and that their megalithic alignments were really the ruins of a forgotten Hyperborean observatory. None of this was true. All of it was filed away in the Ahnenerbe archive in Berlin. A fourth wave went south, in the closing years of the war, into Spain and into the Spanish protectorate of Morocco. A researcher named Otto Bucher spent several months in 1942 and 1943 measuring the great circular stone alignments of Almizarac on the southern coast of Spain, and arguing, in a long report that nobody outside the Ahnenerbe ever read, that the alignments were the remains of a solar observatory built by the original Atlantic civilization before it was overrun by the later Indo-European barbarians. Bucher's measurements were meticulous. His conclusions were fantasy. Behind all of these expeditions, sitting in an office in Berlin and reading every report as it came in, was the man who had quietly become Himmler's personal occult advisor, an Austrian former army officer named Karl Maria Willigut, who liked to call himself Weistor. Willigut was a different kind of figure from the professors. He was not a scholar. He claimed to be a clairvoyant. He claimed to be able to read the ancient runic alphabet with his eyes closed, and he claimed that he had inherited, from a long line of Germanic priests, a complete memory of the lost civilization that had once ruled the world. Willigut sat at the heart of the SS, and for almost a decade he was allowed to design the ritual furniture of the new religion that Himmler was trying to build. Willigut's own personal contribution to the SS cosmology was a wild theory of 9 successive creations of the world, each one ending in a cosmic catastrophe, and each one bringing into being a new and slightly lower form of human being. According to Willigut, the Germanic people were the direct descendants of the highest, oldest, purest form, and the SS year 2000, the millennial horizon that Himmler kept writing in his notebooks, would mark the beginning of the 9th and final creation. Willigut designed for Himmler a personal emblem, a stylized sun wheel with 12 outer arms around a central disk, that was installed in the green room at the top of the North Tower of Wewelsburg, and that has since become one of the most reproduced symbols in the post-war occult underground. Willigut also designed, in the same period, a tall stone monument called the Irminsul, a kind of pagan world pillar that was supposed to rise from a deep shaft at the very center of the castle and connect the upper world of the SS Knights with the lower world of the buried dead. None of Willigut's designs survived the war. In the spring of 1945, with the Allied armies closing in from the west and the Red Army closing in from the east, Himmler gave the order to destroy the castle. The local residents, helped by a few prisoners from a nearby camp, dismantled the building instead, salvaging the roof beams, the ironwork, and the lead pipes for use in the surrounding farms. By the time the first American officers arrived in late May, the castle was already an empty shell, and the few remaining SS officers had vanished into the countryside with the archive. What the Americans found instead in the cellars of a salt mine near Berchtesgaden, and in a converted bank vault in Nuremberg, was the Ahnenerbe archive itself, a wall of cardboard boxes containing tens of thousands of pages of expedition reports, photographs, correspondence, measurement sheets, and the secret internal memoranda that had kept the whole operation running. The archive was shipped, eventually, partly to the Library of Congress in Washington and partly to the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, where it sits today in a climate-controlled room behind 2 locked doors. It is the most complete record of any state-sponsored ideological research program in modern history, and almost nobody has ever read it through. 3 things are worth saying about this archive before we close. The first is that the SS spent more on prehistoric and Orientalist research than any government in history, and produced almost nothing that has survived in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The Ahnenerbe papers are a graveyard of half-finished measurements, abandoned theories, and embarrassingly sincere racial fantasies. The handful of Ahnenerbe scholars who managed to keep their reputations after the war, men like Herbert Jan Kuhn and a few of the language specialists, did so by quietly dropping their affiliation and pretending, for the rest of their careers, that they had been nothing more than ordinary professors. The second is that the popular myth of the Occult Reich, the version that fills the shelves of airport bookshops, is not a Nazi invention at all. It is a post-war invention, cobbled together in the 1950s and 1960s by a small, eager market of European esoteric writers, by the propaganda departments of the early Cold War, and by intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain that found it convenient to believe, or to pretend to believe, that their recent enemies had been in league with dark supernatural forces. The CIA's suppressed transmission files, the British Operation Enchantment memos, the French Stasi reports on Germanic mysticism, all of these belong to the post-war period, not to the war itself. The Nazis were not, on the whole, interested in magic. They were interested in paperwork. They were interested in measured skulls. They were interested in tables of blood types and indices of cephalic length. They were interested in the boring, grinding technical apparatus of an industrial state trying to prove that its own preferred mythology was scientifically true. The third, and the most uncomfortable, is that the bureaucratic realism of the Occult Reich was, in the end, more dangerous than any spell could have been. A single séance in a Berlin salon is a curiosity. A research institute with 30 expeditions, 1,000 employees, and a sealed archive is something else. A secret garden of esoteric beliefs, tended by an inner circle, can be dismissed as the hobby of unbalanced aristocrats. A state-funded program that puts those beliefs on the payroll, that gives them calipers and cameras, that writes them up in uniform typeface and files them in numbered boxes. That is something much closer to a modern machine for turning private madness into public policy. Himmler did not need to find Atlantis. He needed only that enough people, in enough offices, in enough universities, on enough expeditions, be willing to act, day after day, as if Atlantis had really been out there. The castle at Wewelsburg still stands in the Westphalian farmland. The North Tower has been rebuilt as a museum. The Green Room is open to school groups on Tuesday afternoons. The death ring beneath the long table has been preserved under a sheet of clear plastic. The rune carvings on the oak beams are visible, if you ask. The village down the hill remembers nothing, or pretends to remember nothing. The Ahnenerbe archive sits in Koblenz. The Holy Lance sits in Vienna. The Grail, of course, was never found, because it was never lost. What we are left with is a question, and the question is older than Himmler and older than the SS, and older than the medieval poets whose verses the SS loved to quote. It is the question of what a state is willing to do in the name of the past, and how many professors, how many expeditions, how many wooden crates of skulls, how many millions of marks it takes to make a private fantasy feel, for a little while, like the truth of the world. The answer, in the case of the Third Reich, was a great deal. And the answer, in other cases, in other countries, in other centuries, has often been a great deal as well. That is why the story is worth telling, and why it is worth telling carefully, and why the silence that has surrounded it for 80 years is itself part of the story. Thanks so much for staying with us all the way to the end of this one. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you in the next one.